Okay, in this particular lecture, we're going to talk about smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, a little bit about how muscles work as levers and some lifespan changes. But first, we're talking just a little bit about use and disuse of skeletal muscles. Um, when you use your muscles, they get bigger, and that action of a muscle increasing in size, remember, we're not going to ever add muscle cells, but those individual muscle cells can get bigger, and that whole process of a muscle cell, or for anything for that matter getting bigger, is called hypertrophy. So when you use your muscle, those cells actually get bigger. And you got to eat protein and things like that because your muscles are made of protein, actin, and myosin, tropin, and tropomyosin. And so the muscle cell itself gets bigger. But when you don't work out, when you don't exercise and do things, your muscles actually get smaller. And that whole process is called atrophy. So exercise is extremely important, not only for your muscular system itself, but also for your skeletal system, because we know that your muscles have an impact on your bones getting bigger or smaller as well. So smooth muscle, pretty straightforward. We covered this back a little bit in tissues, and so when we compare them to skeletal muscles, smooth muscle fibers are really, really short. They only occur singly. The nucleus is centrally located. Remember, they kind of have this spindle shape to them, so that nucleus is right in the middle, and they sort of taper at the ends. Their myofilaments are randomly organized, so there's no striations, if you remember from back then. Also, there's no transverse tubules coming deep because this muscle is not very big, and so the sarcoplasmic reticulum itself is not very well developed at all. So when we actually have a muscle contraction, we'll talk about two different types of smooth muscle and having contraction. The visceral muscle, so the things we find in like the walls of our esophagus, small intestine, large intestine, stomach, kidneys. And so what happens with this is we get a single smooth muscle to contract, and these muscles occur in like flat sheets. And we'll look at this a little closer when we get to um, the digestive system. But our our muscle fibers are held together by gap junctions. So one's going to impact another, and so we're going to get this sort of rhythmic or peristaltic type contraction. So if we had a big long tube down here, say this is maybe your small intestine, okay, when your muscles contract right here in this particular area, what happens is they kind of come together and they condense and they put pressure on, say, the food that's in your stomach. And so sometimes that food moves forward. It might move back for a little bit of mixing type action. And so when the muscles in this area contract, they're going to signal the muscles kind of in this next section to contract. And so now these muscles, because of those gap junctions and then continuing to send the electrical signal, this is going to contract. So it's like squeezing a tube of toothpaste. Now this one's going to contract, and we're going to push the food further yet. And so we get this sort of, if I can kind of redraw this, it'll be a wave-like motion for moving food throughout our digestive system itself to get the food to move along. So what happens is what we see is sort of this wave-like motion within the walls of our intestines. And so where there's a contraction and where there's relaxation. So the contraction is where the muscles are being, pulled together, pushed together, and the food moves forward. And then that would happen in this section, but I had to draw it so we're relaxed here. So contraction, contraction, contraction. Well, everywhere there's a contraction, the phase behind it relaxes. So this one had contracted and the food moved forward. Now it's relaxing. When this this set of smooth muscles contracts, the food moves forward, it will then return to its relaxed state, and this one will contract again. So we get this peristaltic wave-like motion, if you will, to kind of force something forward. Kind of if you think of like waves in the ocean, pushing things in towards land, like a surfer or whatever the case may be of whatever the ocean's pushing forward. We also have some multi-unit smooth muscle. They're a little less organized and they function totally as separate units. And even the fibers function separately. And we find these like in the walls of our blood vessels. They do a little bit of contracting, specifically like in our veins. They help get blood back to the heart. Yeah, the blood pressure helps a little bit with getting blood back to the heart. But also the smooth muscle in our veins contract. So if we could draw a vein, like let's say in your leg, here's the vein, and we have a smooth muscle fiber in that leg with its nucleus. It's going to contract, and similarly to the smooth muscle in our intestine, it's going to force blood, in this case, back to our heart. The other thing that helps that's a little bit different, and you know, we test on this right now, in our veins we have just like one-way valves in our veins that help assist our blood to move. So when our smooth muscle contracts and pushes our blood through these valves, gravity is going to pull some of that blood back down as your heart beats and then relaxes. Gravity is going to pull some of that blood in your veins back down, and these valves keep the blood from coming all the way, you know, back down this way. So we have these valves that open and close, open and close. Well, you may have heard of varicose veins or seen varicose veins. What happens in the varicose veins is these actually little one-way valves break, and now that blood is allowed to flow back down, and so now that whole vein kind of sticks out, and it's not really good for your blood pressure or circulating in your blood. We also see these types of smooth muscle in the iris of your eye. Remember, iris is the colored part of your eye, and so these smooth muscles respond to different light intensity. Remember, if the light is really bright, here's your eye, there's your pupil, here's the colored part of your eye, the iris right here. If the light is really intense, that pupil gets smaller, and if the light is less intense or it's dark in the room, that pupil dilates to let more light in, and that's controlled by the smooth muscle of our autonomic nervous system. So smooth muscle contraction, it's similar to skeletal muscle, but a little bit different in a couple ways. It's similar that there's an interaction between actin and myosin. We need calcium, we need ATP, and it's triggered by an action potential of electrical impulse. The part that's different about it, there's no troponin. In place of troponin, we have a protein called calmodulin. And so the smooth muscle uses calmodulin in place of troponin, and so the calcium actually is going to attach to the calmodulin. We have two different neurotransmitters. One, the acetylcholine, is going to help with the contraction. The other one, norepinephrine, is going to cause the opposite effect because we don't control it. So we need this negative feedback to cause it to contract, cause it to relax with these two neurotransmitters, acetylcholine and norepinephrine. Our hormones do affect our smooth muscle, so all the types of hormones have an impact on your smooth muscle contracting. You can trigger a smooth muscle contraction by just stretching. If you're stretching rubber, you might feel, or you're working out, but you stretch those muscles, you might feel like you have a bowel movement coming on, because those muscles will contract in your large intestine. These muscles also contract very slowly. That wave-like motion doesn't happen very fast, so it allows not only to push food forward or backward, but that mixing of food. We also don't get fatigued very well. I mean, your smooth muscle can contract for long periods of time, and then they can change in length. They'll stretch out and shorten. So stretch and then come back together and shorten a little bit without changing their how taut they are. Okay. Cardiac muscle, pretty straightforward. We're not going to go a whole bunch into here. Located only in the heart. Muscle fibers are joined by the intercalated discs. They're branched. And there's a network of fibers that act as a whole unit. They're self-exciting. So maybe you've heard of people getting a pacemaker. Well, we have a natural pacemaker, if you will, in our heart that's supposed to help our heart beat. So they can beat on their own. And I think we've seen that in some video clips maybe earlier this year where there's just a group of cells that started to beat on their own. And that's actually how the heart starts beating in a fetus. And so we have these rhythmic contractions. Our heart beats, anywhere from 60 to 100 beats per minute. Um, and if you're working out, certainly that will increase. You want to raise your heart rate when you're working out to get your heart working, because your heart, obviously is a muscle. And if you don't use that muscle, then it's going to atrophy and shrink. So it's involuntary in nature. You don't control it. It will regulate itself. And if you're working out, it'll pick up if it needs to, or it'll slow down if it needs to. And so we have these all or nothing type contraction. Sometimes that's referred to as synctium, um, or maybe you've heard of syncope. You have a contraction or you don't. And so your heart pumps blood to your lungs to pick up oxygen, and then that oxygen comes back to your heart. So we always want to say that oxygenated blood leaves your heart. That's not necessarily true. Um, Oxygenated blood does leave the heart, go to the rest of the body, but then we return to the heart um, unoxygenated blood, and then it's got to go back to the lungs. So sometimes the blood that leaves the heart and goes to the lungs is unoxygenated or carrying carbon dioxide. Um, but for the most part, your heart distributes not only oxygen, um, but all the nutrients that we absorb from our small intestine. There's also a longer refractory period when we're talking about our myogram. There's the little latent period, then we have the contraction, we have the relaxation, and then we have the refractory period before we come back to normal. And it's this refractory period that's a little bit longer in cardiac muscle for that heart to reset to be able to contract. Here's this general chart of characteristics of each of the muscle tissue. We've been through this sort of before, so I'm not going to really talk about that too much. Skeletal muscle actions, they generate a wide variety of body movements, and that action is dependent on a muscle contraction, the shape of the muscle, and how is it associated with a particular joint. And so our muscles with our bones act as levers, and we got four kind of parts of this. That's the ridge bar, or the bone itself, the fulcrum, that's the pivot point or the joint itself, the object that's moved against the resistance, so that's maybe a weight or a box or your books or something that you're picking up that's resisting being moved, and then you have some force, and that force is applied by your muscles when they contract. And so we got first class levers. First class levers have the fulcrum in the middle, a force on one end, and a resistance on the other end, so kind of like a teeter-totter, or a little bit like a scissors. Second class lever, that'd be like a wheelbarrow where the fulcrum's on one end and you have the load or the resistance in the middle, and then your hands or whatever are going to lift it up. That's going to be a little bit like your jaw, and we'll talk about that in a second. And then a third class lever where, again, the fulcrum's on the end, the resistance is on the far other end, and then there's a force, so kind of like a tweezers, as you can see in this particular example here. So some examples I have on each slide here. Some examples of what's going on here. Your bicep brachii actually acts like a third class lever, and here you can see we're moving something in this situation right here. So here's the fulcrum right here. That's your elbow joint. Your muscle contracts, but here's where the force is applied on that radial tuberosity, and then of course whatever it is that you're lifting. So your bicep brachii and your bones act as a third class lever, versus your tricep brachii here. That force is applied right at the tip And so the force is acting in this way, but that force connects to right at that olecranon process. And remember that joint, that olecranon process is on this side of that pivoting of that fulcrum. And so now even though our force is here, or our resistance is here, our force is on the opposite side. So our tricep brachii, along with our bone, specifically our elbow joint, acts as a first class lever. Second class lever is going to be kind of like your jaw and your temporal mandibular joint. That's kind of your jawbone. And so your pivot point is the jaw, and the resistance is in the middle. You got muscles that resist your mouth being opened. Okay, and so those connect to that ramus, kind of like your temporalis muscle that elevates your jaw, and so you resist the opening of your mouth, and so the muscles underneath your mandible connect by your chin, and they open it up. So here we have our jaw, mandible bone. Here's the pivot point. Here's muscles coming down, attaching here, resisting, and other muscles coming here, attaching to this point. So this is where the force is applied to cause you to open your mouth. So that would be like a second class lever. Origin insertions we've kind of already talked about. Origins are the immovable end, the part of the muscle that doesn't move. The insertion is the movable end, and so we've been going over origins, insertions, we've been going over the muscles in our mannequins, and hopefully learning actions of what does that muscle cause in terms of a movement. When we have a movement, we have muscles have a couple different roles or functions in each of these movements when they shorten and contract. And so first we have a prime mover. Sometimes this is called an agonist, not antagonist. That's different. An agonist. This is the muscle that's primarily responsible for making a particular movement. So like the bicep brachii is the prime mover for flexing your arm at the elbow. Okay. Now, there are some other muscles that will help with that, and those muscles that'll assist with that would be synergistic muscles. Synergists, they come along inside. So the bicep brachii is the prime mover. Your brachialis muscle that we put on your mannequins would be a synergistic muscle. So bicep brachii is the prime mover to get your arm moved, and then that brachialis that we put on earlier on your mannequins is the synergistic. It helps the prime mover with its job. We also have antagonists or antagonistic type muscle group. This opposes the action of the prime mover. So for example, the antagonist to your bicep brachii would be your tricep brachii. So it antagonizes or works in the opposite of that prime mover of flexing the arm. And then lastly, we have some fixators, some muscles that actually stabilize a muscle so it can work properly, and it stabilizes the origin of a particular prime mover or hold things in place. And so that prime mover can operate effectively and efficiently. Our scapula has a lot of muscles that connect to it and originate, and lots of arm muscles, but there are some muscles that just hold that scapula in place, and so we put two of those on our mannequin. The serratus anterior and the pectoralis minor help stabilize the scapula. So things like your trapezius and your deltoid and your rhomboids can all make that area move. So the serratus anterior and the pectoralis minor are fixators, a group of muscles that stabilize the origin for some prime mover. And then lifespan changes. This is pretty straightforward, I think. Things decrease and decline over time. You have less energy, so less ATP. You have less myoglobin. Remember, that's the protein that holds oxygen in your muscles, and you have less creatine phosphate in your muscles. So as you get older, they decline. By the time you're about the age of 80, you have half the muscle tissue that you had as you were younger in your 20s and 30s. So that's considerably less. So those muscles shrink over the period of time. And so you can see as body percentages change over time, we lose our muscle mass and we gain, body fat. And so those adipose cells and those connective tissues, they don't really take the place of, but they replace in terms of body composition. And adipose cells, we add more cells, and those cells get bigger, I should say, and the muscle cells get smaller. And so one way to help that is maintain your muscle mass is through exercise. So remember, exercise, you use a muscle, you're going to hypertrophy, it's going to get bigger. You don't use it, it's going to get smaller and atrophy. And so that's all we have as we wrap up this particular section.